All right, Tanya Summary Shiur. It's week 28, Kanai. We are now finishing the first part of Tanya, and we're crossing over into part 2. We're finishing chapter 53, and we're going to be going into the second part of Tanya, Sha'ar Yichud V'Emunah, and we're going to be doing chapters 1 and 2 of that, as well as the introduction. I think we also happen to be crossing over the halfway point of Tanya shiurim in general, because I believe there are going to be 55 of these. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. We have the siyum, the aschala. I'm not sure which is more exciting. So, chapter 53, we're finishing off a concept that we started discussing of, you have the mashal of the Yunuka that essentially says that a person is like a candle, and the Shekhinah dwells on their head, and mitzvahs are the fuel. So we're trying to understand what exactly this means. Is the Shekhinah everywhere? Or what's the deal with this mashal in general? So the Alter Rebbe, to explain the concept of Shekhinah being everywhere, compares it to a body, that you have the soul, and the soul is present throughout the entire body. The entire body is subservient to the soul, is nullified to the soul, but ultimately you would say the main dwelling place of the soul, the main place of expression of the soul, is in the head. So you would ascribe the soul as being in the head of a person, even though the soul is fully present throughout the entire body. And it's true that the soul is present throughout the entire body, and it's also true to say that the soul has a certain presence which is greater in the head, more so than anywhere else. So in chapter 53, the Alter Rebbe says that the analog for this with the Shekhinah is apparent in two kinds of ways. So he says the first thing is that in the first Beis HaMikdash we had this miraculous concept called the Arin. And in the Arin, we had the two tablets, the Luchos HaBris, the tablets of the covenant, that had the entire Torah written on them, in some very physics-breaking way. Not to get into all the details of that, but essentially, the Luchos were a physical kind of manifestation of God's will, of the Torah, of everything, just solidified into 2.5 by 1.5 by 1.5 amma box. I mean, the Luchos weren't that size exactly, but in that box, in the Arin, that was this revelation of Hashem's will in a physical manifestation, which is a mind-blowing and mind-bending concept. And they say about the Arin that it didn't occupy physical space. If you would put it in a room that's 10 amas across, and you would measure from one side of the Arin to the wall, it would be 5 amas, and from the other side of the Arin to the other wall, it would be 5 amas as well. But then if you measure the Arin itself, it's 2.5 amas, and where the 2.5 amas go, we don't know. It breaks physics. It defies logic. But it's a physical manifestation of the essence of Hashem's being invested in the world in some kind of miraculous way that I can't properly pretend to explain. But ultimately, this is a revelation of godliness in the world. This is one form that the dwelling of the Shekhinah takes, and that's why we say that the Shekhinah was present in the first Beis HaMikdash. And the second Beis HaMikdash, we did not have a revelation of the Arin in the Beis HaMikdash. We didn't really have the Arin in the Kodesh HaKodashim. Whole sikh of the Rebbe about maybe we technically did, halachically speaking, but not to get into all of that. The point is that in the first Beis HaMikdash, it was very clear that Aaron was sitting over there, and we had that form of revelation of Hashem, of divinity in the world. So that is one way that you could say that the Shekhinah manifested itself. The divine presence was felt in the world, was in this actual physical manifestation of Hashem's dwelling in the world in a very literal sense, in a physics-breaking way, in a way that breaks basically all of the rules. That is one way that we have it. The other way that we have it is it says that after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Hashem only has in this world the Dalet Amis of Halacha, the 4 cubits of Halacha. What this is to say is a person's personal space when they are doing a mitzvah, when they are following Halacha, when they are doing one of the 613 mitzvahs. They are then becoming themselves a physical expression of Hashem's will. They are not just the idea of Hashem's will, but they are the actual application of Hashem's will. So when a person does this, they are a dwelling of the Shekhinah in this world. So this is why we say that the Shekhinah wants to be on a person, but there needs to be a mitzvah, there needs to be something to hold on to the Shekhinah, that the Shekhinah could eat at, something that the Shekhinah could consume in a certain sense, something that the Shekhinah could latch onto, to be in this world on the person. Hashem wants to be with the person. Hashem wants to be with Yidden, but unfortunately that's not feasible if there's no fuel. The same way that if you have a candle and you light it, and there's no fuel, what will happen is the wick will burn, and it'll be no more. So we need to have some kind of fuel for the Shekhinah. And another point is that the wick burning down, the Alter Rebbe says this corresponds to, in the parable, this corresponds to the Nefesh HaBahamis, the animal soul, that it's either broken down or it's completely turned over, depending on who's doing the Aveda. But ultimately, that when we abnegate the Nefesh Bahamas in one way or another, that causes that there's something for the fire to hold on to as well, not just the fuel, but the candle itself. The candle itself is the fact that we're able to take physicality, the physical medium, and to use that to capture the flame, to capture the Shekhinah. So just to summarize, you have the candle, you have the oil, and you have the flame. The flame is the Shekhinah, and the Shekhinah wants to be in the candle. What keeps the Shekhinah, that there's something to consume, is the oil. The oil is mitzvahs, that when we do mitzvahs, that gives fuel, that there could be a revelation of divinity in the world. And the thing that actually happens with is the wick. The wick is the Nefesh Bahamas, the animalistic soul that we have, that it's either turned over or it's crushed in whatever way that we abnegate physicality. Ultimately, what it causes is that through the abnegation of physicality and the divinity of the mitzvah, we're able to cause the revelation of the Shekhinah, the flame. That is the example of the Yanukah, or the parable of the Yanukah, and that is the conclusion of chapter 53, and with it, the conclusion of the first part of Tanya. With the help of Hashem, may you be blessed and uplifted. So, part 2 of Tanya starts off with an introduction called the Chinuch Katan. Perhaps the entire second part of Tanya is called Chinuch Katan, but definitely the introduction is called Chinuch Katan, and it makes sense because it talks about the concept of Chinuch, and it starts out and it says in Mishlei, Chanuch L'nar al pi darkei, that you should teach a child according to their way, because even when they age, it won't depart from them. So, the Alter Rebbe says that we need to understand something about a funny implication in this pasuk, because the pasuk implies that really the way that you educate a child is not the true way. But why are you educating the child? Because even when they're older, they're not going to stray from the path. If it would be a true education, you wouldn't need to say, educate the child so that when they're older they won't stray from the path. It would be educate the child in the truth, because the truth is the truth, and so there's no problem with the fact that you're going for something lower than the truth. But the pasuk implies that no, you educate a child even if it's not 100% true, but that way they're not going to stray from it when they're older. So the Alter Rebbe says we need to understand this. So the Alter Rebbe says, first let's try to understand something else. It says in Parshas Ekev, it's a mitzvah to love Hashem. So the Alter Rebbe says, how is it a mitzvah to love Hashem? How can you command me to love someone? If I love them, I do, and if I don't, I don't. So the Alter Rebbe says, actually there's two kinds of love that exist for Hashem. There's one love, which is a very lofty form of love, which is called Ahava B'Tanugim. It's more of a reward kind of love, that Hashem will reward you if you're zeichet to having this kind of love for Hashem. It's a really pleasurable love to have. Then the Alter Rebbe says there's another level of love, which is lower. And that level of love is love that comes through contemplation. When a person meditates on Hashem, they appreciate who Hashem is, and everything that goes along with that. That causes that a person will feel inspired to love Hashem. It's a love that's bound in their understanding. It's not a true love, if you will. It's not something that leaps out of the soul like a flame of fire. It's a love that you have an appreciation of the facts, and that causes you to love Hashem. So the Alter Rebbe says, this love is the love that we're commanded in, the love of contemplation, the love that comes from contemplation. The other kind of love is not a mitzvah. You can't be commanded to do it. The lashon of tzivui doesn't apply to it. You can't tell someone to have a love that just springs forth on its own. But the love that we get through contemplation, that the Torah does command us to do. The mitzvah of Ava, says the Alter Rebbe, is that we need to contemplate who Hashem is, and everything about Him, and everything that He does, and ultimately to inspire within ourselves a love for Him. So the Alter Rebbe says, now we can get back to the idea of Chanech L'nar al pi darkei. When we say al pi darkei, that it implies that it's only according to the child's way, and that it's not the true way. It's not the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. It's just mostly the truth. What we mean is that you're operating on a lower level. Not that it's a completely non-true way of Avodah. The ultimate that we would hope for is to have this very lofty kind of love. But ultimately, sometimes, we need to work on a lower scale. We need to work on a lower level. We can't always be at the highest levels. And the Alter Rebbe says even that if a person wants to go from one level in Avodah to another level in Avodah, to a certain extent, they need to step down from where they're holding in their level of Avodah to be able to reach even higher. This isn't the Alter Rebbe's example, but it's an example that's brought in the Gemara, that Rabbi Zera wanted to go from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael to understand their learning style, and it says that before he did so, he fasted a certain amount of fasts in order to forget his style of learning from Bavel, so he could properly appreciate the style of learning in Eretz Yisrael. Because in order to go from his one level of understanding to a higher level of understanding, he had to first step down. He had to forget where he was holding in his first level. So in the same way in Avodah, when a person goes from one level of this lofty love to another level of this lofty love, they first need to step down. And when they step down, the platform that they can step on is their love that they have, the love that everyone has, the love that we're all commanded to have, the love that we get through contemplation of Hashem and who He is and what He does for us and all of these things that we could wax poetic on, and we did wax poetic on in the first part of Tanya. So this is the lower level that can be used as a kind of resting place, the place that you could say, this is the basic that I have, that I know I have, that I don't need to go anywhere from it, while a person tries to figure out how to reach the next level. Now, 2 points that I think are worth mentioning before we move on to the first chapter of Shayach V'Amunah. Remember, this is the introduction. The first one is that the Alter Rebbe has an introductory note to the introduction saying that this is based on the first paragraph of Kriya Shema. And I think it's interesting to note that the first paragraph of Kriya Shema contains all of the elements discussed in this part of Tanya. It contains the concept of Yichud of Hashem. It contains the concept of loving of Hashem. And it contains the concept of Chinuch as well, that it says, V'shinantam levanecha v'dibartem bam, that you should teach them to your children. And so everything is wrapped up kind of nicely. And then at the end of the introduction, the Alter Rebbe says that from here on out, we're going to be discussing particularly the pasuk of Shema Yisrael and the sentence of Baruch Shem. And both of those refer particularly to different levels of Hashem's unity, and that is what will be discussed throughout this second part of Tanya. The other thing that I think is important to note is that the second part of Tanya is very theological, and it really cuts to the core of what Hashem is, if you can even say that, how He exists vis-a-vis the world, or how the world exists vis-a-vis Hashem, and it cuts really to the core of a lot of those topics. And I think it's important to appreciate that, firstly, not everyone necessarily would say nowadays that they agree. I think some people would say that perhaps from a place of amaratzos, and some people would say that from a place of learnedness. But regardless, this was definitely not necessarily the norm in the Alter Rebbe's day of how to appreciate these delicate and intricate matters of theology. And I think that there's a possibility that the Alter Rebbe was throwing in this introduction, not just to explain to you why it's important to have a foundational knowledge of the unity of Hashem, but also to kind of throw in the idea that anything that keeps a person from has a certain mila, a certain merit, a certain advantage, in that when you take all of the philosophy and you put it aside, ultimately this conception that we're taught as children is something that keeps us on the right path. And ultimately, a person shouldn't look down on their original understanding, however true it ends up being. Ultimately, that a person should try and should endeavor to have some kind of path that they're on that will keep them doing what Hashem wants. And hopefully we can build on that to the point where we have true contemplations, and that those contemplations can bring us to the mitzvah of Ava, and it can bring us even higher, hopefully, with Hashem's help. But that ultimately, we needn't feel bad about whatever flaws our original understanding or our original education may have had. Ultimately, we can go higher than that, and we should. So, without any further ado, let's get into the second part of Tanya, past the introduction to the first chapter. And the first chapter starts off, and it says, that you should know today, and you should bring it into your heart, that Hashem is the God in the heavens above and in the earth below. There is nothing else. The Alter Rebbe says, do you really think that everyone was pasha thinking, oh, you know where there's really another Eibusher hiding out? Really, there's some cave in Saudi Arabia that you go deep enough into the cave, that's where there's another God hiding out. The Alter Rebbe says, okay, that's ridiculous. Well, what's the pasuk coming to tell you? That there's no other Hashem above, there's no other Hashem below. So the Alter Rebbe starts explaining by quoting a verse from the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov says in the pasuk, Olam Hashem dvarach nisav Hashemayim, that eternally, Hashem, your words are standing in the heavens. The Alter Rebbe says what this means, or the Baal Shem Tov says what this means, is that Hashem is constantly creating and recreating the world with His utterances. He's constantly speaking the world into existence. And then what this means is ultimately that Hashem created the world with 10 utterances, the Asar Mamaris, that Hashem created the world with them, which are referenced in Mishnah even, and through different permutations of the letters and different gematrias of the letters of these 10 utterances, ultimately Hashem creates the world. So even though, let's say, the word stone wasn't mentioned in the Asar Mamaris, or the Hebrew word Evan, because everything is created with Lashon HaKodesh, that's why it's the holy tongue. So even though the word stone, Evan, was not uttered in the 10 utterances, but ultimately it derives itself from some permutation of the letters of the 10 utterances, and Hashem is constantly speaking the world into existence by means of utterances. And yeah, Shalom Yisrael, that's how the world exists. So that concludes chapter 1 in a nutshell. Chapter 2, the Alter Rebbe says, okay, now I need to completely rewrite the way that you view the world. So here we go. The Alter Rebbe says, from here we have an answer to a lot of apostates. I'm not sure what the right translation for minim is, but for people that are kofrim and nishkacha pratis, they deny the idea that Hashem is constantly involved with the world. So the Alter Rebbe says, their problem is like this. They think that creating the world is like creating a table. That you go to the shop, you get wood, you put it through the machines, you screw in the screws, and you nail in the nails, and whatever fancy stuff you got to do to make a table, and then ultimately you put the last layer of shellac, and bam, you got a table, and then you could walk away, and the table stays there. So these people think, we don't really need Hashgacha Pratis in our conception of how Hashem interacts with the world, because He just creates the world and technically could walk away. Now, if you want to say that Hashem is technically involved with the world, you can make that claim. But then I could start telling you back, oh, well, why would Hashem be busy with everything? You think Hashem really cares about all those ants that are crawling around? Why would Hashem be invested in all of that? So once you have the idea that you could say Hashem just puts the world aside, like a craftsman puts aside a table once he's done fashioning it, once you've arrived at that point, you could then start debating, maybe Hashgacha Pratis, yeah, maybe not. The Alter Rebbe says, with this understanding, it's impossible to say that. Because creating something from something, creating a table out of wood, the wood already exists, it's a full existence. To take that and just change its shape and leave it in the room, it's going to stay the same. You haven't made anything new. What you've done is you've taken something and you made it into another something. But the essence of the thing has already been there. It's just you've taken a something and you made it into something. The Alter Rebbe says that this is in contrast to what Hashem does and what He did at the beginning and what He continues to do now, which is that Hashem makes the world out of nothing. There is a complete non-existence, and Hashem is constantly pushing the world into existence. The Alter Rebbe says, by way of example, it would be like Kriyas Yamsuf, for example. That Kriyas Yamsuf is you have water, and water, what it does is it's a bunch of molecules, and there's some kind of connection between them, but they're all, there's no form. I believe the definition of a liquid is technically a bunch of mass that is somewhat connected but does not hold its shape. Someone could fact check me on that. I think that's vaguely the definition, at least if it's not exact. But the point is that, yeah, water flows around. That's what water does. If you take a wind and you would blow water really intensely at a wall, you'd be able to flatten it out into a wall shape. You could do that, which is what happened by Kriyas Yamsuf. The nature of water is that water is going to keep on falling. You don't say if you blow the wind at the water and you happen to be pressing it flat against the wall constantly, that now the water is flat against the wall. It's a solid. You haven't changed the matter of the water. You haven't changed the state of matter of the water. Water is still liquid when you do that. If you freeze it into ice, you've changed the matter. You've changed the state of matter. But the water itself is staying water. You're just constantly applying a force to it that causes that it's in a certain shape. But once you remove that force, it's no longer in that shape. So the Alter Rebbe says that this is the same thing with Hashem's creating the world. Really, there's no existence. No existence is, if you will, the default. I don't like using that word because that implies that there's a default of non-existence, and really there's a default of nothingness. A null set, if you will. Because it's hard to accurately describe the idea of saying no default. But ultimately, Hashem pushes the world into existence by means of His utterances. And through His speech, He's causing that the world exists. But the world is existing against whatever else should be. It's not that the world exists and now the world is here and weitergefahren, you could walk away like you do with the table. Because the table, you're taking something that exists and you haven't changed the fact that it exists, you've just changed the shape. But over here, there's nothing. You're pushing nothing into being something. For that shift to happen, it needs to be a constant pressure. The Alter Rebbe then says, I need to make one more point, which is, you might tell me, oh, you're okay for saying that Hashem is talking. The Alter Rebbe says, it's not that Hashem is blowing at water and He's keeping it in the shape of a wall. When I say talking, I don't mean that He's existing in the world. He's existing in an oxygenated atmosphere, and he's talking, and by virtue of the air around, you can hear the words. The Alter Rebbe says, no. What I mean by talking is the same way that when a person talks, they're revealing what's going on in their mind. When Hashem talks, He's revealing the essence, the source of the 22 letters with which He creates the world. But ultimately, when I say talking, I mean, says the Alter Rebbe, I mean revealing, that Hashem is revealing Himself and His wisdom, everything that goes into making the world what it is. The Alter Rebbe says this is the same way that we say that Hashem talks to a Navi. It's not that Hashem pops down here and He's talking Gashmis, Chas v'Shalom, Chas v'Chalila, to say that. What we mean is that Hashem is revealing, He's talking the world into existence. He's able to reveal to Navi different parts of His talking the world into existence. So a Navi is privy to different revelations of divinity that Hashem is revealing in the world, that which causes the world to exist. A concept to think about, work out all the chinks, but ultimately, for a summary, it has been a long week, but 21 minutes is Kanai Nahara, I think one of the longest ones yet, if not the longest. So, Mir Hashem, next week to be continued with more on the subject in chapter 3, another parable, some defenses of the Baal Shem Tov's formulation of theology, however you want to call it, and Mir Hashem, looking forward.